King Edward I, a complex ruler of law and war. The temperament of a monarch. King Edward I of England, often referred to as Edward Longshanks, was known for his formidable personality and commanding presence. Historical records and anecdotes illustrate a ruler who was both feared and respected, his temperament veering between moments of extreme fury and instances of paternal gentleness. His reputation for a fierce and sometimes unpredictable temper is well documented. One particularly striking episode recounts how the Dean of St. Paul's, intending to challenge Edward over the heavy taxation policies imposed in 1295, collapsed and died upon encountering the king's presence. The sheer force of Edward's personality was enough to intimidate even those who occupied high religious and political offices. Similarly, a 14th-century chronicler attributed the death of Archbishop Thomas of York to the king's harsh treatment. This suggests that Edward's intensity in governance and personal interactions had real and dire consequences for those around him. His son, Edward of Carnarvon, experienced his father's fiery temper firsthand. When the young prince petitioned for an earldom on behalf of his favourite courtier, Piers Gaveston, Edward I reacted with an explosive display of rage, reportedly yanking out handfuls of his son's hair in anger. Such episodes contributed to the widespread perception of Edward as a fearsome and formidable ruler, particularly in his early years. During his reign, he was likened to a leopard in the Song of Lewis, written in 1264. At the time, leopards were considered not only powerful but also unpredictable and aggressive, characteristics that seemed to align with Edward's approach to governance and warfare. Yet, despite his ferocity, Edward also demonstrated a softer side, particularly in his familial relationships. He was known to be deeply devoted to his large family, maintaining close ties with his daughters and showering them with lavish gifts whenever they visited court. This duality of nature, his capacity for both harshness and warmth, underscored the complexity of his character as a king. Edward's image as a ruler. Despite his sometimes severe demeanor, Edward was widely regarded as a capable and effective monarch. His English contemporaries did not necessarily love him, but they certainly feared and respected him. This is evidenced by the relative stability of his reign within England. Unlike other medieval kings, he faced no major armed rebellions against his authority. His ability to maintain order, even in a period marked by frequent military campaigns, suggests that his rule was strong and unchallenged domestically. However, Edward was not without his faults, and his propensity for vindictiveness and triumphalism has been criticized by historians. He relished the humiliation of his defeated enemies, frequently employing symbolic gestures to assert his dominance. For example, after the conquest of Wales in 1283, Edward confiscated sacred relics, including fragments of the Holy Cross. Similarly, following his victories in Scotland in 1296, he seized the Stone of Scone, an object of great national significance to the Scots, as well as their royal regalia. Such acts were designed not only to consolidate his rule but also to send a clear message of subjugation to those he had conquered. Edward's dealings with Wales and Scotland have led some historians to question his integrity and trustworthiness. There is evidence to suggest that he was capable of deceitful and manipulative behavior when it suited his political aims. His repeated breaches of agreements and his imposition of harsh conditions on his defeated foes point to a ruler who prioritized power over diplomacy. Historian R. Davies remarked that one of the most consistent and unappealing aspects of Edward's kingship was his tendency to belittle and humiliate his adversaries, reinforcing the perception of his reign as one of domination and coercion. A king of chivalry and faith. Despite his ruthlessness in political matters, Edward met the contemporary expectations of kingship in many respects. He was a skilled and determined soldier, embodying the chivalric ideals that were highly valued during the medieval period. His military campaigns, while often brutal, were conducted with a clear sense of strategy and purpose. Historian Michael Prestwich has argued that Edward's effectiveness as a ruler stemmed largely from his ability to balance martial prowess with administrative competence. Edward was also a deeply religious man, conforming to the spiritual norms of his era. He attended chapel services regularly and was known for his generous acts of almsgiving. He held a particular devotion to the Virgin Mary and St. Thomas Becket, two of the most venerated figures in medieval Christendom. Like his father before him, Edward participated in the royal touch ceremony, which was believed to cure those afflicted with scrofula, a disease commonly known as the king's evil. Records suggest that he touched upwards of 1,000 people each year in an effort to heal them, reinforcing his image as a divinely ordained ruler. However, despite his personal piety, Edward often found himself at odds with the Church. His relationships with the archbishops of Canterbury were frequently contentious, and his disputes with the papacy over ecclesiastical taxation were particularly notable. Edward saw the Church as a useful tool for governance and military mobilization, frequently leveraging religious institutions to justify his wars. He employed the clergy to disseminate pro-war propaganda, issuing writs to England's archbishops instructing them to promote his campaigns through sermons and prayers. Edward's architectural projects also had a propagandistic element. His construction of the Eleanor Crosses, a series of memorial monuments honoring his late wife, Eleanor of Castile, was not only an expression of grief but also a demonstration of royal authority and piety. These grand structures reinforced Edward's image as a devoted husband and Christian king, while simultaneously serving as visible reminders of his power. The Arthurian connection. Edward was fascinated by the legends of King Arthur, a figure who loomed large in medieval European imagination. Arthurian myths were widely popular during Edward's reign, and he actively engaged with them, seeking to draw connections between himself and the legendary king. In 1278, he made a notable visit to Glastonbury Abbey, where he ceremoniously opened what was believed to be the tomb of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. The event was a carefully orchestrated display meant to associate Edward with the mythic legacy of Britain's greatest ruler. His interest in Arthurian lore extended beyond symbolic gestures. After his conquest of North Wales, Edward claimed to have recovered Arthur's crown from the Welsh prince Llewellyn ap Gruffydd. Additionally, his ambitious castle-building campaign in Wales incorporated Arthurian themes, strategically placing fortresses in locations tied to the legends. By doing so, Edward sought to weave himself into the fabric of British mythology, reinforcing his rule over the newly subjugated territories. Edward even staged grand events styled after Arthurian traditions. In 1284 and again in 1302, he hosted elaborate round-table tournaments, featuring jousting, feasting, and celebrations reminiscent of the legendary court at Camelot. Chroniclers of the time compared Edward's court to that of King Arthur, further legitimizing his reign in the eyes of his subjects. However, Edward's engagement with Arthurian myths was not purely driven by admiration for the tales. He also used them as a political tool, particularly in Wales, where the legend of Arthur's return was a powerful symbol of resistance against English rule. By co-opting the myths and positioning himself as Arthur's successor, Edward sought to undermine Welsh hopes of reclaiming independence. This strategic use of mythology exemplifies the calculated nature of Edward's kingship, his ability to manipulate cultural narratives to consolidate his authority. King Edward I was a monarch of great complexity, fierce yet familial, ruthless yet chivalric, deeply pious yet politically pragmatic. His reign was marked by military conquests, legal reforms, and a profound sense of personal authority. While his temper and harsh treatment of adversaries left a lasting impression, his ability to govern effectively ensured that he was respected, if not always loved, by his subjects. Edward's legacy endures as that of a formidable king whose reign shaped the course of English and British history in profound ways. Administration and the law under Edward I. The restoration of royal authority. Upon his ascension to the throne in 1272, Edward I undertook an ambitious campaign to restore royal authority and order following the turbulent reign of his father, Henry III. Edward recognized that the stability of his reign depended on effective governance, and he swiftly moved to reorganize and reform administrative structures. One of his first significant actions was the comprehensive overhaul of key administrative personnel, ensuring that those in positions of power were both loyal and competent. Among the most crucial of these appointments was that of Robert Burnell as Chancellor in 1274. Burnell, a trusted confidant of Edward, would go on to serve in this capacity until his death in 1292, shaping much of the legal and administrative landscape of the realm. Under Burnell's guidance, the administration was revitalized, and a more effective system of governance was implemented. That same year, Edward also replaced many local officials, particularly escheators and sheriffs. These changes were instrumental in preparing for a broader investigation into local governance and land ownership, which would play a central role in Edward's legislative reforms. Edward's determination to reinforce royal authority was evident in his dealings with the nobility. Many barons had accrued significant power during Henry III's reign, often ruling their estates with little regard for the king's authority. Edward aimed to reverse this trend and ensure that all lords were subject to the crown's oversight. His reforms sought to curb abuses by local officials while also reasserting royal prerogatives that had been eroded over time. This period of restructuring would define his rule and cement his reputation as a strong and capable monarch. The 100 Rolls and the inquiry into royal rights. One of the key initiatives launched early in Edward's reign was an extensive inquest into royal land and administrative abuses. This inquiry sought to address two primary concerns: the usurpation of royal lands and rights during Henry III's reign, and the misconduct of royal officials. The findings of this investigation were compiled into a set of census documents known as the 100 Rolls. These documents have often been compared to the 11th century Domesday Book due to their comprehensive nature and their significance in shaping subsequent legal proceedings. The 100 Rolls served as the foundation for a series of legal inquiries known as the Quo Warranto proceedings. The fundamental question posed in these inquiries was, by what warrant, Latin, quo warranto, were liberties and privileges held? The Crown asserted that unless an individual or institution could produce a royal license proving that their liberties had been granted by the king, those liberties should revert to the Crown. This argument was largely based on the legal doctrines of Henry de Bracton, a 13th-century legal scholar whose writings significantly influenced English law. Edward took these investigations seriously, personally overseeing aspects of the inquiries to ensure compliance. His approach was meticulous, with officials sent across the realm to collect evidence and record claims to various rights and privileges. The information gathered through the 100 Rolls allowed the Crown to take direct action against those who had unlawfully acquired lands or assumed privileges that did not have proper authorization. The results, though contentious, laid the groundwork for a more structured and accountable system of governance. The impact of the Quo Warranto proceedings. The Quo Warranto proceedings represented a direct challenge to the entrenched rights of the aristocracy. Many noble families and local officials had long exercised various liberties without explicit royal authorization, often relying on long-standing tradition as justification. Edward's legal challenge provoked considerable opposition among the aristocracy, who argued that continuous, uninterrupted use of privileges should be sufficient to establish legitimacy. In response to this backlash, a compromise was reached in 1290. Under this agreement, liberties that had been exercised since the coronation of Richard the Lionheart in 1189 were deemed legitimate. While this settlement limited the immediate gains Edward could make from the Quo Warranto proceedings, it nonetheless established a crucial precedent: all liberties ultimately derived from the Crown. This principle reinforced the notion of centralized royal authority, even if the practical gains in terms of land and privileges returned to the king were minimal. These legal disputes often created tensions between the monarchy and the nobility, leading to further negotiations and legal clarifications. Although Edward sought to limit baronial overreach, he was also pragmatic, understanding that outright confiscation of privileges could lead to rebellion. His ability to navigate these legal complexities demonstrated his political acumen and reinforced his reputation as a lawgiver. The legislative reforms of Edward I. The Quo Warranto proceedings were only one aspect of a broader program of legislative reform that characterized Edward I's reign. Edward was deeply committed to legal and administrative restructuring, recognizing that a well-defined legal framework was essential for effective governance. His legislative initiatives built upon earlier reform efforts, such as the Statute of Marlborough, 1267, which incorporated elements of the provisions of Oxford and the dictum of Kenilworth. One of the first major statutes issued by Edward was the First Westminster, 1275. This statute sought to assert royal prerogative by outlining restrictions on local liberties and reinforcing the authority of the monarchy. It was followed by the Statute of Gloucester, 1278, which further challenged baronial rights by reviving the system of general heirs, royal justices who travelled throughout the realm to hear cases, and significantly increasing the number of quo warranto cases being heard. Another important statute was the Statute of Mortmain, 1279, which addressed the issue of land grants to the Church. In an effort to curb the growing accumulation of land by religious institutions, often done to avoid feudal obligations, this statute restricted the ability of landowners to transfer property to the Church without royal approval. By doing so, Edward ensured that land remained subject to feudal duties and that the Crown maintained control over land ownership. The Second Westminster, 1285, further expanded on previous legislative efforts. One of its most significant clauses, de donis conditionalibus, dealt with the settlement of land within families, ensuring that land granted with specific conditions remained within the designated lineage. This was crucial in regulating inheritance practices and preventing land from being freely alienated. Edward also sought to strengthen economic regulation through legislation such as the Statute of Merchants, 1285, which provided clear rules for the recovery of debts. This statute was instrumental in fostering commercial stability by ensuring that merchants had legal recourse in cases of unpaid debts. Additionally, Edward implemented the Statute of Winchester, 1285, which aimed to enhance law enforcement and local security. This statute reinforced the system of local policing, requiring communities to take collective responsibility for maintaining order and apprehending criminals. It also mandated regular mustering of able-bodied men to ensure they were prepared to respond to breaches of the peace. In 1290, Edward issued two critical statutes, Quo Warranto and Quia Emptors. While Quo Warranto focused on clarifying the legitimacy of liberties, Quia Emptors addressed disputes over land ownership. This statute sought to prevent the problematic practice of subinfeudation, in which landowners granted portions of their land to tenants who, in turn, granted it to others, leading to confusion over feudal obligations. By stipulating that all land sales had to be direct transfers, Quia Emptors simplified land tenure and reinforced feudal hierarchies. The end of the legislative era. The period of extensive legislative reform largely concluded with the death of Robert Burnell in 1292. Burnell had been a key figure in Edward's administration, playing a crucial role in drafting and implementing the statutes that defined this era. Without his guidance, the pace of legal innovation slowed, and Edward's focus increasingly shifted toward military campaigns and foreign policy. Nevertheless, the legal and administrative reforms enacted during Edward's reign had a lasting impact on English governance. His efforts to assert royal authority, standardize legal practices, and regulate land ownership laid the foundation for a more centralized and structured monarchy. Although he faced resistance from the nobility, Edward successfully reinforced the principle that all authority ultimately derived from the crown, a notion that would shape the development of English constitutional law in the centuries to come. Finances and Parliament under Edward I. Edward I's reign, 1272 to 1307, marked a significant period of financial and parliamentary reform, particularly in regard to the coinage system, taxation policies, and the evolution of parliamentary representation. These reforms were driven by the need to finance Edward's extensive military campaigns and the broader goal of centralizing and strengthening royal authority. The period saw an overhaul of the English monetary system, improvements in fiscal management, and the establishment of a parliamentary model that would influence future governance. Furthermore, these changes helped to stabilize the economy, maintain social order, and create a stronger foundation for future monarchs to govern effectively. The overhaul of the coinage system. By the time Edward ascended the throne in 1272, England's monetary system was in dire straits. The coinage in circulation was of poor quality, a problem that severely impacted trade and economic stability. Counterfeiting and coin clipping had also become rampant, leading to significant economic losses. In 1279, Edward initiated a sweeping reform of the coinage system, which involved the introduction of new coins of superior quality. These included the continued production of pennies, halfpennies, and farthings, as well as the introduction of a new denomination known as the groat. However, the groat failed to gain widespread acceptance, and its circulation remained limited. One of the major innovations during Edward's monetary reform was the improvement of the coin-making process. Traditionally, coins were stamped out from sheets of metal, but under Edward's reign, a more efficient method was introduced by the money William Wallace. His method involved cutting blank coins directly from a silver rod before stamping them, which not only increased efficiency but also helped in maintaining uniformity in coin production. This method reduced wastage and ensured that coins had a consistent weight and value. Furthermore, Edward's reign saw significant changes in the administration of England's mints. Previously, coins bore the name of the money responsible for their production. However, Edward centralized the minting process under the Crown's authority, eliminating the need for individual moneyers' names on coins. This shift ensured greater control over the coinage and reduced instances of fraudulent minting. The king also implemented stricter oversight measures, appointing officials to inspect and regulate minting operations, thereby reducing corruption and mismanagement. Despite these improvements, counterfeiting remained a significant problem, particularly on the European continent. English coins were frequently counterfeited in regions such as the Low Countries, where their high silver content made them valuable. In response, Edward imposed a ban in 1283 to prevent the exportation of English coinage, though records indicate that these restrictions were often circumvented. The illegal trade of English currency abroad created ongoing challenges for the Crown, forcing Edward to take further legislative measures to punish offenders and restrict unauthorized minting. A critical measure taken by Edward to stabilize the currency was his decision in August 1280 to withdraw the old long cross coinage from circulation. This forced the population to transition to the newly minted currency, ensuring uniformity and eliminating the worn-out and clipped coins that had previously been in use. The success of these monetary reforms provided England with a more stable currency, facilitating trade and economic growth during Edward's reign. Merchants, both domestic and international, benefited from a more reliable monetary system, fostering economic expansion and strengthening England's position in European trade networks. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.